Thankfully, the board unanimously agreed to preserve El Zaguán, and frankly, there is no other property in Santa Fe like this. And in many ways, it mirrors the entire history of Santa Fe, including the Santa Fe Trail. And so I just briefly want to hit some of the highlights. It was once the home of James L. Johnson, a well-to-do Santa Fe trader from a prominent Maryland family. In 1854, he purchased an old adobe house and corral on Canyon Road from Juan Bautista Moya. He enlarged this property considerably, kept adding new pieces of land, and built a large territorial-style adobe home where he and his wife raised seven children to adulthood. Now, this is unusual because there were a number of other wealthy merchants, but they built homes near the plaza using architectural styles popular in the East. And here we have Johnson living in an adobe house in a sparsely populated area and fields cultivated by local Spanish families. In fact, he married a Mexican woman, Maria Jesus Montoya from Chihuahua. And then he kept adding rooms with 3-foot thick walls. They included a chocolate room where chocolate was ground and served each afternoon. And we might want to consider that tradition in the future. There was a treasure room with barred windows. There was a private chapel, and there was a semi-detached room overlooking the west garden for a library, which was said at the time to be the largest in the territory, and it eventually totaled 24 rooms with servants' quarters across the street. On the lower terraces behind the houses were orchards, a cornfield, and large corrals where freighters on the Santa Fe Trail kept their horses. So this also mirrors kind of the agricultural history of Santa Fe, which makes this a really unusual property. By the 1870s, Johnson was one of the city's most successful businessmen. Then in 1880, the railroad arrives, and his fortunes changed dramatically. So what happens? The Santa Fe Trail ends, and we don't even get the main track of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad here. We get a little spur line which runs on occasion. And at first, city leaders said, this will be fine. This is not a problem. Everybody will come to Santa Fe anyway, but it was not fine. Santa Fe at the time was the largest, most prosperous city in the territory. It was soon overtaken by Albuquerque. And we have newspapers like the Lordsburg newspaper, of all places, has articles stating newcomers are attracted to the railroad towns of Las Vegas and Albuquerque, which they consider real American cities, unlike Santa Fe, which is viewed as remote and foreign and an out-of-the-way place. Who would want to go there? And so during the next 30 years, the city's population declines by nearly 25%. And James Johnson just didn't adjust with the times. I think some of them did. He did not. He basically lost his shirt. He mortgaged his property to Thomas B. Catron, who I know you all know that name as a very powerful Santa Fe politician, lawyer, leader of the Santa Fe Ring. And unable to make good on his loan, in 1881, Catron assumes control and leases it to Johnson, who continues to live there with his family, but he is now a renter, not an owner. Then in 1891, the Johnsons invite a family friend, pioneer Southwest archaeologist and ethnologist Adolph Bandelier, who's also having a little bit of hard times too. He invites him and his wife to come live with them. And by this time, this property boasts this magnificent garden with peony bushes imported from China, 2 large chestnut trees. And I mention this because in our early literature put out by the foundation, this is called the Bandelier Garden, because if Bandelier was here, he must have produced it. You know, he's a well-known person. But later we realized the credit really goes to Mrs. Johnson and likely her daughter, Margaret. So Bandelier is here for about a year. Then James L. Johnson dies. And instead of a glowing obituary, here's what comes out in the Santa Fe New Mexican. This is 1897. At one time, Johnson was one of the wealthiest men in Santa Fe. At the time of his death, he was in moderate circumstances, having met with many reverses. But the chapter continues. Thomas Catron, 1901, deeds the property to his son Charles. 4 generations of Johnsons are living here at the same time, and they continue to live here. And then in 1918, finally, one of Johnson's grandsons, James Baca, buys the property for $2,500, and he adds indoor plumbing and apartments. But then Baca begins struggling financially. And there's a lien on the property now to Bronson Cutting, who's the publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. I'm sure that name is very familiar. Now Cutting owns it, and by 1927, Cutting has become a U.S. senator, and he wants to unload this property. He doesn't want the encumbrance. And in 1928, a woman by the name of Margretta Dietrich, who is currently recuperating in a hospital in Nebraska, receives a telegram saying that Bronson Cutting is about to sell the property to a development company, and she buys it. And so we embark on the next chapter in the history of El Zaguán. So we have really 2 major chapters that I'm talking about, the Johnson and his family, and now Margretta Dietrich. And so who was she? Well, she was the daughter of a very prominent Philadelphia physician. She was a graduate of the nearby Bryn Mawr College. She married a Nebraska Senator, Charles Dietrich, the widow father of one of her classmates at Bryn Mawr, and moved to Nebraska, and she became very involved with the League of Women's Voters, becoming regional director. And that's all part of the history of this place, too. She first came to Santa Fe in 1921, accompanied by her husband and sister, artist Dorothy Stewart. And she's come to give a speech for the League of Women's Voters, and she arrives in Santa Fe about noon. This is according to her memoirs. She has the first meal at the Blue Parrot, run by 2 delightful women in a lovely old house at the corner of Palace Avenue and Burrow Alley. And, quote, the house had many patios with sheep in one of them. And enchanted by it, my sister begged me to buy the whole block. Wouldn't this be nice? But at the time, Margretta says, we were not ready to invest in Santa Fe real estate. And she had some serious reservations about the architecture here. She was invited to stay at the home of one of the officers of the League of Women Voters who lived on Canyon Road, and I'm thinking it must have been Ina Sizer Cassidy. And her house, writes Margretta, has been described to us as beautiful, and by Santa Fe standards it was, but at first glance it was not at all what we had expected. It was built flush with the sidewalk and was constructed of adobe with wood from an old mission church. To our eastern eyes, it appeared a little crude. But as so often happens, she wrote, once captivated by the attractions for Santa Fe, we could not resist coming back. And so both would later move here, as would many other people from the east, particularly during the 1920s, because by the 1920s, Santa Fe is now dubbed the city different. It's begun reversing its economic decline. It has stopped trying to be like Eastern cities. It has stopped French Second Empire style architecture, and it's now emphasizing the Pueblo revival style. So fleeing industrial America, artists, writers, and others come seeking the more authentic life that Santa Fe seems to offer. And others, like John Galmeme, who becomes part of our story here, seeks healing from tuberculosis in its high, dry climate. So anyway, in 1924, Margretta Dietrich's husband, who's 28 years older than she, dies. And in 1927, Margretta and her sister, Dorothy, moved to Santa Fe, then a town of about 7,000, and they purchased a house at 519 Canyon Road, just down the road here, the Juan Jose Prada house, and that's where she would spend the rest of her life. But the following year, the old Johnson property goes on the market, and Margretta is fearful this thing is going to be torn down. And she says, I couldn't bear to think of the place cut up into small lots, and maybe they would construct large buildings, and that would obstruct her view of the mountains to the east. So she buys it. And then she later buys a third old Spanish house, the Borrego house at 724 Canyon Road. But now that she owns it, what on earth am I going to do with this? I don't need a house. I already have my house. So she decides she's going to turn the Johnson place into an elite summer hotel. And you can imagine what shape this property is like at this time. So she hires architect Kate Chapman to make the necessary improvements. And by the following summer, she writes, the building has been remodeled, refinished, and furnished, and named El Zaguán. So she names it El Zaguán for its long corridor, which opens at the west end into the old garden and into a patio at the east end. And it proved an absolutely daunting task. The wiring and the plumbing were not in good shape. The floors were almost worn out. The beams in the reception room, the main room, were sagging from the weight of layers of dirt. She spent as much as the building cost in repairs alone. And Kate Chapman built garages, a heating plant, 3 cottages, and the cottages replacing the farm buildings on the north end of the property. And her sister Dorothy Stewart builds a studio, La Galeria Mexicana. And the hotel venture was not a success. Lois Field, another Philadelphian who would make Santa Fe her home, describes her stay here in March 1929. She says, the little Hotel El Zaguán is a dear. Just an old Spanish house modernized as little as possible to take in boarders. So that was kind of the end of that. Then in 1932-33, the building is leased to Brownmore for use as a girls' boarding school. And its 16 students included Helen Chapman, the daughter of Kate Chapman, Kate and Kenneth Chapman, Elizabeth Wiley, who later became a teacher here and who I interviewed for the Health Seeker book. She died just a few years ago. And students were called to class by use of a tom-tom. And I don't know, Pete, if you use that for your board meetings, or anyway. But this venture proved short-lived too. And the following year, the school found a more permanent home at Bishop's Lodge, where it remained for 12 years until it went to Phoenix. And then a year after the school departs, Margretta turned the building into fully furnished apartments, and its tenants were primarily women of modest employment. And by 1940, there were 11 apartments here. Margretta also became known for her parties. And in 1930, she and Dorothy hosted a fiesta with 200 gaily celebrants to dedicate the new fountain at El Zaguán, which you will see on this tour. The Santa Fe New Mexican reported that, quote, Margretta was charming in her grandmother's quaint gown and her pink high shoes. But Margretta was first and foremost a community activist, and this passion was undoubtedly fueled by her education at Bryn Mawr College. Carrie Thomas, who was the president at that time, encouraged her students to pursue their passions and not dismiss them as being inappropriately feminine, but also to focus on social reform. Let's make our society a better place. And Margretta was one of 5 classmates who arrived in Santa Fe during the 1920s, and they called themselves the Bryn Martyrs. That's a term they coined, as one of them explained. A Bryn Martyr is a woman selflessly devoted to improving the lives of others. And they were a force to be reckoned with. You didn't want to mess with them. The others included, just briefly, Gertrude Ely, daughter of the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And you know, when they wanted something done, Gertrude Ely wanted to do something about Indian affairs. She met with Roosevelt. I mean, it was those kinds of connections. We also had Elizabeth Shepley Sargent, a writer originally from Massachusetts. And in 1920, she and Gertrude Ely restored a crumbling adobe in Tesuque, which I understand is where Charlie Miner's studio is. It's a project she described in a 4-part article published in Harper's Magazine. And Harper said, you've got to explain why a woman who could live in Paris wants to live in an old adobe. And then in 1923, we have Amelia Elizabeth White and her sister Martha, daughters of a wealthy newspaper publisher, arrived from New York City. Purchasing property in 1923, they built El Delirio, home now to the School for Advanced Research. So you got 5 very powerful women with incredible Eastern connections, doing some very critical things here in Santa Fe. They really changed the culture in many ways. Upon arriving in Santa Fe, the Bryn Martyrs found its culture threatened by the same forces they were trying to escape. And they quickly joined efforts to protect Pueblo land, improve health, promote native art. Margretta Dietrich played a key role in the New Mexico Association on Indian Affairs, eventually becoming president. That organization took over the administration of the Southwest Indian Affairs, and it's a precursor to our Indian market. All 5 were involved in the Indian Art Fund, established in 1925 to collect historic and contemporary Native art in order to both document and revive what they consider was kind of a dying tradition. And it's a collection that's now housed at SAR. In 1926, when the Southwest Federation of Women's Clubs decided to establish a culture center here, the Bryn Martyrs and their artist friends sprang into action, deciding they needed to get rid of that brood of vipers, even though they were women very similar to themselves. And overnight, they formed the Old Santa Fe Association, dedicated to guiding new growth in such a way as to sacrifice as little as possible of the unique charm and distinction of the city, a very important organization today. Margretta was one of the founders and a major contributor to the Spanish Colonial Art Society, which was incorporated in 1929. And at the time of her death in 1961, Margretta was considered one of the most influential patrons of both Indian and Spanish colonial arts. In 1962, the executors of her estate, Sylvia Loomis, who was her secretary, and the First National Bank of Santa Fe, sold the property for some $40,000 to El Zaguán Incorporated, a newly formed nonprofit headed by John Gaumim. And in 1979, the stockholders transferred the remaining shares to the historic Santa Fe Foundation. And so with the implementation of the El Zaguán master plan, the foundation is embarking on a new phase, and included will be numerous improvements as well as a permanent exhibit documenting its rich history. And do give some thought to the chocolate room. That would be such a wonderful improvement. But anyway, enjoy your tour of this incredible property. Thank you.